Well, then, I am going to officially kick us off as soon as I hit send on this email to Mary Sue, who's having a little bit of technical problems with the sound. So, all right. So, welcome everybody to the fourth rollout of Giants fifth grade. Tonight, we are going to be covering Unit 5. And Unit 5, if I pull open our pacing view off of the website here, Unit 5 is the road to revolution. So those of you who are looking for, where's the French and Indian War? Where are where's the lead up to the Revolutionary War? It is in this particular unit. And we will do a little bit, just so you know, this is a full unit that really hits the lead up to and the French and Indian War itself. And then after this unit, when we come back together in early March, we'll do Unit 6, which starts off with Unit 6 is, I believe, a 4 lesson unit. And it starts off with the things that I think many of you will be expecting to see more in depth tonight than we're actually going to go. And we'll get into things like the various acts and how the colonists reacted to them. We're going to introduce them in this unit. Because again, you're probably not taking a break between a unit to teach something else, although some of you might be. So we're going to start that conversation in 3 of this unit, and we will continue it in lesson 1 of Unit 6. So as far as what you're going to see tonight, let me go into our overview document. Our compelling question for this unit is centered around how does conflict create change? And you could almost lift this compelling question and put it smack dab in the Revolutionary War as well. We use a slightly different question in the next unit, but the next 2 units, our compelling questions are really about change and how conflict can sometimes breed change. And these are 2 fairly big conflicts that we're going to look at both in this unit and next. That had a lot of repercussions for us even through to today. So, content wise, we're looking at the 3 ones. If you are following your content expectations verbatim, we're looking at most of the 3 ones with a couple of those creeping up again in the next unit as well, along with the 3 twos on the Revolutionary War. So, getting into the individual lessons, our first lesson is going to be basically introducing this idea of, conflict and how it can shape a country.
Mhm.
And the supporting question for this first part is what set the stage for and triggered the French and Indian War? So, lesson 1 is really going to be leading up to the Revolutionary War itself. I'm sorry, the French and Indian War itself. We're going to get a little bit into what else has happened in the colonies since last we were in there. And we're going to go through some of these activities in just a few minutes. And then when we get into lesson two itself is going to start to actually outline the war itself. And you'll get some background information on some of the indigenous nations, which Phil is going to do out of context. We've just put Phil all in one big block here. So when Phil does that, I'll make it a point to let you know that this is the activity that comes from lesson 2 when we get there. And then it's going to take you through some of the famous figures, and 2 in particular that were selected because of their importance to some activities that are going to come up in lesson 3 as well. And then we'll get into the war itself. So there's lots of good stuff in here. For those of you who love the French and Indian War, I loved teaching the French and Indian War as part of my 8th grade class as review when I would do the review unit prior to kicking off my actual content expectations. I liked starting there because those 2 wars together do a nice job of sort of framing the headspace we were in. I launched my Constitution unit as an 8th grade teacher. So, and then the final lesson in Unit 5 kind of brings the war to the close. We'll talk about the Treaty of Paris. We're going to highlight some stuff with the Treaty of Paris tonight. And then we're going to get into, the preview of the stuff that will continue in lesson one of unit six next time that we're together, that really gets into colonist sentiments after this war is over and how Great Britain tries to pay for said war. So all of this is the focus of about, again, 6 weeks worth of instruction. And to kick us off tonight, I'm going to start by kind of showing you a few of the activities that, well, not a few of the activities. I'm going to kick it off tonight by sharing with you the basic overview using where'd it go? I have too many tabs open. I'm feeling like I work for the Department of Ed right now. There is a movie trailer here for something called The War That Made America. And this is a microsite that goes along with your local PBS station. So I got asked if Detroit is mine. Technically, Central Michigan is mine, and I could change that here. But I'm not going to show this trailer here as part of this because I do not want another copyright issue with YouTube here. But we link you out to the site that used to have the full episodes archived here. Now you pretty much just have the trailer. So you've got access to the trailer. And I recommend using that as one of your starting activities for this unit, is actually showing this trailer and saying, we're moving into a time of conflict in US history, and we're going to talk about two different wars over the next few months, and both of them are big and both of them had major repercussions for us overall. So recommend that you show that to your students as part of your intro activities. And of course, we also are still giving you the supporting and compelling question posters that you can have up in your room. I like these again in lieu of I can statements, because sometimes an I can statement in social studies is a little bit less than we would like to see. I would recommend having your compelling question one up for the whole unit. So how does conflict create change would be up for your whole unit. And then as you move through each lesson, put underneath it the supporting questions. And we have, again, linked them back to content expectations if you have administrators that are looking for those things. So lesson one is what set the stage for and triggered the French and Indian War. Lesson two is what shaped the progress and outcome of the French and Indian War. And lesson three is going to be how did relations change with Britain and France after the French and Indian War. So if you're detecting a theme here, it's intentional. We're doing that on purpose because this whole unit is about, you guessed it, the French and Indian War. So as far as activities go, I'm a little bit ahead of schedule because we didn't do a major welcome because we kind of need to dive into the content. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And even though it's a couple of minutes later, I'm going to turn things over to Phil, who I know will fill his time and my little bit of extra if he needs it. So, and if he doesn't, then we're out a few minutes early tonight. So Phil, why don't you take it away? Phil's going to run us through the next couple sets of activities here.
And you see 4 PowerPoints up there?
I do, in fact, see 4 PowerPoints up there.
Okay, that's kind of where we're going. I've got a card in front of me that has what I was doing when we were thinking about designing something for this window of history there. And the notion of falling dominoes, or the race to a million people, or the sun never set in the British Navy, all of these activities came out of a kind of a four-fingered imperative that I was sensing. The first one is that we've kind of fallen into an excitement gap for a variety of reasons. Reason number one is it's January and February. It's dark and cold and drizzly, and statistically, today's the coldest day of the year, although you couldn't tell it in Kalamazoo because we're up at 40 and have freezing rain on the top of this. We got this little bit of an excitement yet. Back in the fall, we're talking about Jamestown and Plymouth and Pocahontas and all of these cool stories. And then we get to the actual war and we get Braddock and Washington and fight over Fort Duquesne and things like that. And the gap in between is a little awkward. At the same time, we've also got a reading and activity gap. Um, that there are a lot of videos and things like that about Jamestown and Plymouth and Pocahontas and Washington and so on. We wind up having just a lot of reading to do in this area in between. The third problem is that cool videos and stories about Jamestown and Plymouth and Pocahontas and I don't know, the Salem witch trials and things like that. These are very salient, but kids often have a hard time putting them into a chronological context. And then the last thing that I've got is that we're laying a foundation for the early constitutional era. And we want to make sure that that foundation is solid. And one of the places that it's not particularly solid is even using the word French and Indian War to describe what's going on here. Because that kind of simplifies what's going on in the world. So with that, let me show you 4 activities that actually involve students in activities, that their purpose is to try to put a lot of these anecdotes and videos together into some kind of an organization that makes it a little more memorable. And it falls into this awkward gap, and it sets the record a little bit straighter for what we're doing later on. So the first of these PowerPoints is about falling dominoes, how a Dutch trading post started a long sequence of events. And you know the metaphor, that we've got a domino, and if you push on this one, it's going to push on the next one, and and the result is, anyway, the activity is very simple. It's 12 very short paragraphs, a 2-page list. Now, let me tell you something about these paragraphs. I'm not going to actually do this activity now, and I'm not going to have us do it. But I do want to explain the logic of it. The letters that are here are deliberately chosen to kind of link to it. B for Basque, and C for Cheyenne, and D for Dutch, and E for the Erie people, and so on. Doing it this way does a great job of kind of randomizing them chronologically, because the task for the students is to put them in chronological order. That is, you read the paragraph, and the paragraphs are very carefully written so that each one of them has a sentence that clearly identifies something that happened just before it or just after it. So that's the task. Now, you can use this worksheet if you want, or you can go back to the previous frame that was there and just cut these strips apart and give them to different groups, or give them to a student as an independent subject and have them rearrange them in a chronological order. I mean, there's a variety of ways that you can use this raw material. I also give you 2 answer keys. One of them that actually takes the whole paragraph and puts them in order, and the other one is that has a 1-page summary of these that you can go down for kind of quick reference on your desk as you're running a discussion with the kids afterwards. And what I did with this one is I gave you a color code as to what, that Henry Hudson was 117 years after Columbus, but the Bass fisherman was at the time of Columbus. So that puts them in order. And these sentences are lifted out of the paragraphs. And like I say, this is a set of falling dominoes, because when the Dutch people built the trading post next to the Hudson River and they sold guns to the Iroquois started attacking all of their neighbors. I mean, all of their neighbors. The Susquehannas to the south, and the Ottawas to the north, and the Ojibwe, and the Erie people out west. All of those people had 2 choices: stand and fight and probably die because the other guys have guns and you don't, or move. And a whole lot of these people wound up moving further west. Uh, Simultaneously, the French traders had started to build missions and trading posts. So when we talk about the French traders trading with the Ojibwe people, it's the Ojibwe people had just moved into this territory. They hadn't been there for more than about 15 years. Um, then the French traders sold guns to the Ojibwe, and the Ojibwe did exactly what the Iroquois had done. They used those guns to go attack the Lakota and Arapaho and the Cheyenne. Now, you think of all of those people as being out on the Great Plains, but they all lived in Minnesota at the time. And when Ojibwe people were pushed out of eastern Canada into the Wisconsin, Minnesota area, they pushed the Arapaho and the Cheyenne further west, which winds up with a real kind of awkward political situation, especially for us people that were in Minnesota, where I used to teach, because the Lakota were claiming, that the Black Hills were sacred to them somehow, that they'd been put in that place forever, when in fact the Lakota had only been in the Black Hills for about 40 years. They actually lived in the Red River Valley of Minnesota first. Like I say, that's the raw material. Now, the question I would like to get a poll from you guys is, would you use something like this to introduce the topics? Or would you use it to accompany what's going on as you're explaining all of these things a little bit more? Or would you use it after you've done that as a kind of a way of reviewing that past history? And if you've got a strong opinion one way or another, let me know about it. And we'll try to build it into the discussion in the middle column of the giants as a guidance for other teachers like that. Because from where I'm sitting, this is whatever works in your given class on your given day kind of question. And that's bearing in mind that this is January. Some days you walk into the class in January and you just know they're not up to an independence activity. And other days, they're not up to listening to you talk and they just want to have something to do. So I don't know the answer to this question. I just want to try to provide the raw materials that give you the best way that you can approach that question. Because in fact, you can do it another way. And this is where I do the first of my, maybe we ought to have our bullshit meters kind of tuned up a little bit, because there is a little bit of nonsense floating around in some of the textbooks. And that is that the Iroquois had some kind of a unique confederacy. And this is a place where you could actually just turn your class loose. The first page that you can download is just background information for you. The page that says Confederacies Among Indigenous People, examples, is background information for you. This is a list of 14 different confederacies that groups of native people had put together at various times. And the Iroquois Confederacy was basically put together to help them deal with Dutch traders and things like that. And so this becomes a kind of an independent process there. The activity that you might try with students, if you just want to kind of tune out for a half a day, is to give each one of them one of these confederacies and a couple websites that they can look at, and their job is to come up with a map of, well, I'll give, we've got a possible worksheet that they could fill out. It says, what nations were involved in this particular confederacy. Mark the general area where they were on the map above. If they had moved into this area recently, put an arrow where they moved from. So you see how an activity like this is kind of putting together information that they might have gotten, 6 weeks earlier or 4 weeks earlier, along with some fairly well chosen websites that you can use. And then for your own background information, I put in one more, and that is that confederacies that I've mentioned so far were all in Eastern North America, and here's a whole bunch of them that were in East and Western North America about the same time. Or, and I've used that word a couple times before, but I'm going to use it again. You could use the geohistogram to do what I've suggested you might have done with those paragraphs. Or you could, well, I'm going to ask you a question at the end of this. How many of you have seen this geohistogram before? Um, and if you're sort of familiar with it, this is a different way to organize the timeline. I'm not going to go into a big elaborate explanation of it, except to say that there is an article out there in the Journal of Geography that explains the neuroscience that's behind the geohistogram. I will just make a couple quick sentences to summarize that. Sentence number one is a timeline that goes from left to right actually discriminates against about a third of the people in your class. And one of the reasons that it does that is that in your brain, the timeline goes from bottom to top. And this is actually the way archaeological records are. The oldest artifacts are at the bottom of the midden heap, and then people pile them up. The oldest foundation is at the bottom of the building, and then if they build a new building, it goes on top of that. The oldest rock layers in your geology class are at the bottom, and then new layers get laid down on top of that. Or if you want a more contemporary illustration, the oldest papers on my desk are the ones that I put down there 3 weeks ago, and then I keep piling stuff on top of it. But the fact is, in your brain, the timeline actually is a vertical timeline with the oldest near the bottom and the newest up near the top. And the geohistogram is designed to take advantage of that fact. It also says, as long as we're going to do a timeline, why don't we also make it a geography line and let's have it go from west to east? So the Basque fishermen, which were the first things in that set of the short paragraphs, happened about the year 1500, or maybe a little bit before 1500. We don't know exactly. All we know is that there were a whole bunch of Spanish artifacts in North America long before Jamestown and Plymouth came along. And the Basque were way off toward the east of the Grand Banks. So you would put a B over there. And then you could say, I could use this diagram to help me organize both the space and the time of any new event that might happen. So Henry Hudson goes up the Hudson River about the year 1600. That coincidentally is just about the same time that Jamestown started. And then what a lot of people don't realize, it's also almost the exact same time that Santa Fe started out in New Mexico. The Dutch built a trading post along the Hudson River. They would have had to do this after Hudson discovered the Hudson River. So you put that up a little bit more recent. And then once they had built that trading post, the Iroquois came and started to buy guns from the Dutch. They used those guns to attack other tribes. This coincidentally was just about the time that French traders started to build forts and things like that in places like Detroit and Michilimackinac. So you've got those things happening at about the same time, but in different regions of the country. Blue is the Northeast, green is the area around the Great Lakes, and so on. With the new guns that they bought from the French traders in Michilimackinac, the Ojibwe pushed the Lakota out of Minnesota. Um, the Lakota then went and pushed the Cheyenne out of the Black Hills a little bit later and a little bit farther west. If you want to put these things into a historic context, this is happening just about the time that gold was discovered in California, and that triggered a migration from two directions. A lot of people came from the east out to California, but an awful lot of people came across the Pacific Ocean from places like China and Korea toward California. You can see how the geohistogram as a diagram helps us show both the time and the place of a whole bunch of these separate events. But like I said, one of my purposes in developing these activities for January was to help students put together the things that they have learned with videos and readings and are probably storing in their brain as a whole bunch of, separate and somewhat disconnected, just individual memories. They don't have them hooked together. So I go back up here. The Civil War came shortly after the gold rush. And one of the consequences of the Civil War is to take that big, wide purple blob, which was the South, population, economy, and political clout. And one of the effects of the Civil War was to make the South lower in population, less effective economically, and much less effective politically. And so we had that blob kind of shrink down to become a whole lot narrower. And I should have left that on to say, oh, and ironically, exactly during the Civil War, Congress passed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was supposed to bring immigrants in and give them free land out in the West. So a lot of people came in from Europe and moved out to the free land that they could, and the population of both the Great Plains and the Great Lakes area started to grow very rapidly. So when Custer loses the Battle of the Bighorn, it really is putting together two of these migration flows. The first migration flow was stimulated by the falling dominoes. The Dutch selling guns to the Iroquois, who pushed the Ottawa people into Michigan, who pushed the Lakota people out toward the west, who pushed the Cheyenne people still farther west. And the Homestead Act brought in a bunch of people from the East and people from Europe to claim the free land. And those kind of collided because people who had been enemies for a long time, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ojibwe, and the Lakota, those people formed a confederacy. And they put together an army that was bigger and better equipped than Custer's army. And when Custer goes out there, so you see what I'm trying to do is to put this whole bunch of separate events into a story that, coincidentally, your brain has encoded in four different ways. That it has encoded the general position of every one of those events in the big box. And that happens in one brain network. Another brain network encodes each event along with the color that it is near, and so that you know that the Iroquois were in the Northeast and that the Ojibwe were out in the Great Lakes area. The third way in which your brain has encoded them is relative position between these individual little squares. And the fourth way that it's encoded in is with the words that were attached to it. So like I say, this is a powerful graphic device. And it's probably not too soon to be starting to use it, even for just 5 minutes, like I just did. And it took me exactly 5 minutes to do that presentation. So that's the end of that presentation. What I
Phil,
was suggesting,
towards the
yeah,
next, can I interject real quick?
go for it.
What I love about some of the things that Phil brought up there, in particular, is if you have a textbook that shows Native American tribal territories in it, you can take that textbook map to any one of Michigan's 12 tribes and say, hey, can you give me your opinion on this map? And they will tell you to rip it out of your textbook immediately because boundaries and borders and things like that are sort of a European construct that came over to the US and not something that the indigenous peoples really practiced or believed in. So what I love about that activity set that Phil just had there is that's one of many places where you could bring that sly little detail up. Now there are some very good maps, including a couple that I believe we've got linked in the units proper, that do a good job of showing rough zones and areas and corridors, if you will, of where a lot of these tribes were, but being very nomadic and moving around different areas. Anytime you come across a map that says these were the native regions, take that with a grain of salt and feel free to teach your young scholars that they should as well, because borders and boundaries were not a thing. So just wanted to add that since you had a good chunk on Indigenous peoples there, Phil.
Yeah. And I would underline the other thing that you should tear out of the textbook, and that is the stuff that the Iroquois Confederacy was somehow a unique thing that had happened with one group of native people, and that we modeled our Constitution in some way on the Iroquois Confederacy. Um, what can I say? That just drives my BS meter up into the purple zone, and leave it at that.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Does that mean that my open book's gonna get some tweaking? Please, please.
If you're talking about the Iroquois Confederacy part in there, there's a standard on it, so we had to address it, but we tried to address it as nebulously as possible, which may have led to an additional set of irritants and problems. But
Yeah.
And what about the region map? Is that,
so I believe the region map that's in there is the territory-based one. I believe that one's good
it's
because
the
we worked with Eric on that, and the
yeah,
original map that was in there did get ripped out. So
yeah.
And in any case, if you if you could even make a mini activity out of this for students to say, take the territory of the Ojibwe people and then have a big arrow coming from the east into that territory, and have an arrow going out the other way to say, when they showed up in Michigan, there were people in Michigan already, and they pushed them out, and that war got a little bit serious when it got over into Minnesota. And most of my background here is working with the Red Lake tribe in Minnesota, a group of Ojibwe people in Minnesota that I would have to be tread fairly lightly, is to say exactly, what was the nature of this history. And one of the ways that you can tread lightly is to emphasize that these people talk to each other a lot. I mean, you don't form 14 different confederacies among different tribes out in the East without having rather regular exchange of what today we would call diplomats or ambassadors. That there was a lot more communication among Native people than we give them credit for. And like Dave says, if you mark them into their own little territory, then you kind of underplay the fact that there was actually this very fluid interchange. In fact, some of the tribes had the requirement that you could not marry somebody in your own tribe, that you had to have a wife from another tribe. So, like I say, part of what we're doing here is trying to take what has often been described as a very simple story and to make it into a somewhat more complicated story. And that's part of the reason for this next PowerPoint, which is about the sun never setting on the British Navy. Now, I've got a couple dates here that are way out of the time frame that we're talking about right now, because what I'm going to show you is just about 10 frames from a PowerPoint that you actually might want to use when you're talking about the revolution. But I want to put it into a historical context, because what I'm saying about the sun never setting of the British Navy during the Revolution also applies to what we kind of laughingly refer to as the French and Indian War. Um, so let me show you just about 10 of them. You'd say, how did you wind up with this? I got invited to a conference about social studies and art. And as part of that conference, I had to put together a little bit paper. So I thought maybe I would just use, I mean, you're looking at an old painting of a ship getting blown up in a big naval battle somewhere. And the ship that got blown up was a first rate ship of the line, which meant it had 700 people on it, give or take 100. Um, we're going to look at some of these old paintings as a source of historic information. You could call them visual primary documents if you want. And again, when I was teaching in New York, where the historians just loved primary documents that were, somebody's handwriting, I was sort of tweaking their nose a little bit with that to say, a painting can be a primary document too. So here's a painting of the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay between the French and the British forces in 1781. This battle was the absolute key to Washington's victory at Yorktown. If the French hadn't beaten the British at this time, the British would have successfully restocked Yorktown and Cornwallis would have won, and history would be really different. So here's another painting, and it shows another battle near a place called Cape St. Vincent. And this one happened in 1781. And there was a battle near something called the Dogger Bank, and this happened in 1780. And there was a battle near Louisburg, Nova Scotia, and this happened in 1780. And one near Grenada in the Caribbean, and this happened in and one near Saints near Jamaica, and one near Morocco, and one near Gibraltar, and one near St. Kitts, and one near Porto Praya, and one near Trincomalee. Actually, not one, 4 separate battles near Trincomalee, near India. So I just said, if we've got all these old paintings and they all show battles and all the battles have dates on them, why don't we put these on a map? Because the map tells us a very interesting and important story. That it is true, there was a battle near where Washington was at Cornwallis. And it involved a number of ships from the British Navy. But if you notice, the British Navy had a whole bunch of ships in a whole lot of different places around the world at the same time. And these were sailing ships. So there is absolutely no way that Graves is going to get 19 ships down to St. Eustatius in 2 months. It's just not going to happen. The British actually had something like 105 ships of the line. Okay, let's just jump to the summary. The British Navy and a couple dozen slave traders and a couple dozen explorers were active in a lot of places in the late 1700s. This required a lot of ships and a lot of sailors. And that helps you put into context why impressing of sailors is such a big issue in the Declaration of Independence. That the Brits were really kind of desperate. They'd pretty well, scraped up every able-bodied person who was willing to go out and get seasick. But here's the messy question. Were the American colonists really standing up against the might of the British Empire? Or Was the British Army and Navy overextended and simply unable to send enough ships? Now, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to let the British answer that question because we could look for supporting evidence. And one very useful source is a letter written in 1778. This is right in the middle of the Revolutionary War from the First Lord of the Admiralty. That would be like our defense secretary to the admiral, the commander of the North American station. And in that letter, that person said, the object of this war in North America has now changed, and the contest in America is of secondary consideration. Our principal object must be distressing France and defending His Majesty's possession around the world. Basically, Montague was telling Howe, America is just not that important. We need the ships in about a dozen other places around the world. You're going to have to make do with what you have. Too bad that you got beat by the French. Too bad that Cornwallis couldn't get rescued. Too bad that we lost the Revolutionary War. But it really wasn't the Americans that beat us. It was the World War that was happening all around the world. And Britain just could not afford to send enough troops to fight the revolution. Now, that's what happened then. You can actually set the stage for that with a multi-purpose activity that is in the middle of the French and Indian War, which, by the way, should not be called the French and Indian War. During the 7-Year War, I've put down here a list of some of the naval battles that Britain was fighting at the time of the 7 Years' War. And it's a pretty long list, and I just kind of ran out of space over here. But between 1755 and 1763, this was a worldwide war. And this is a dual purpose activity because about right now, you've got to review latitude and longitude as one of the geography glicks that are in there. And I'm modeling one way that you can analyze historic data like that, that you could simply give that list to the students. If you notice the way the list was structured, it's got the latitude and the longitude of each one of these battles. So all they would really have to do is just put a dot where they happen to have occur. And you notice that, oh, look at that. The French and Indian War was happening over here, and Britain was fighting all these battles in all of these other places around the world at exactly the same 5 years. So let's take a quick look at what might be British priorities at the time. Priority number one would have been to protect Gibraltar, because Gibraltar was not only the way that British sailors could get into the Mediterranean, it was the way that you could keep French, Italian, Moroccan, and Spanish boats. Those ports were generally all on this coast right here. And if you had a good fort at Gibraltar, you could keep them from getting out and bugging you, you know. So that would be number one priority. Number two priority would be to protect India. Now, India was a source of spices, but even more important, India was a source of tropical hardwoods like teak that were essential to make British ships rot resistant. And Britain had already started building a part of theirs. You know, they were beginning to globalize their supply chain for shipbuilding, and they were building the hulls in India. So that was the third thing that they would want to protect was sugar and tea, because these were the biggest import commodities into Britain at the time. Then, kind of tied for fifth, was the Spice Islands of Indonesia and the tobacco and indigo that they got from North America. That explains part of the reason why the more important battles of the Revolutionary War happened in the South, in places like Kings Mountain and Camden and Yorktown and so on. even though a lot of the history books tend to focus on New York, it's partly because the history books were written in New York. Um, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Revolution. But if you look at the British priorities, North America just was not up on that list very high. In fact, the only thing that was lower was Australia. And they were starting to build their prison colonies out there. Now, partly because North America wasn't a good place for them to send their prisoners, but they had been doing that. A third way that you could approach this whole story is through the clickable maps. And there is a clickable map about the colonies. And if you go to that clickable map, this could be individual, group, or whole class. And you click on the places and the arrows, those buttons there and those buttons. And you can make an activity about this right now and just have the students circle the territory that is controlled by Britain, the territory that's controlled by France, and the territory controlled by Spain. Or you can click on the right buttons. You can actually see those territories drawn on the clickable map if you don't want to make an activity out of this. The activity for the students would be, can you predict where the battles will occur in the French and Indian War when it comes? In other words, can you look at that map and see the places where these different countries are starting to run into each other in their territories? And if you came up with that, then you wind up having Fort Duquesne and Braddock and Washington, all of that. You've also got the activity that was happening up in Nova Scotia and in Maine. You've got this little bitty battle that were happening at the same time between the British and the Spanish down around Fort Augustine and Fort George over here, and some battles between the British and the French here near Fort Toulouse. In other words, these places where these colonial powers were coming together. So again, I'm giving you the raw materials to do these things in different ways, in different orders, depending on what you think is the most appropriate way to present it. But also kind of reading your class on a given day, and you might just decide, I just want to talk about this today. Let's just give them something to go read about the Indian confederacies or something like that. No comment, Dave?
I just threw in the chat because I did not see Chris's question until just a minute ago. Basically, I don't know of a map that has a Venn diagram piece of it like that, but in Googling to try to find, first I went to OpenBook to try to find the map proper, and that page, it just shows up as a shadow, not a map, which is odd. So I have a office day coming up this week. I'll have to investigate that. But in trying to Google to find the map that we used, or were supposed to have used, ended up finding a really cool NPR article that links out to an interactive map that is sort of what Chris was asking for. And I may end up utilizing that both in Giants and in OpenBook because I like what I'm seeing. So that's what was happening in the chat while you were doing that part. Sorry, Phil.
Okay. So the last one, he said I was supposed to say something about settlements. And again, I want to say something about settlements by putting it together with other things, both in the past and looking toward the future a little bit. And we put together a PowerPoint called The Race to 1 Million. And that's the race among a number of different cities. So there's a typical map of the 13 colonies. It's just lifted directly off of your clickable. It's also the map that you use for your colonies game. You can add the mountains to it, and that gets even closer to the map that we've got for the colonies game there. And at the time of the Revolution, the British colony had 4 main cities. And again, I'm using the Revolution as the anchor, but I want to look back to what was happening during the so-called French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, or the World War Number One, 1A, or whatever you want to call it. There were four cities that had sort of notions that they ought to be the capital of the country. And in fact, way back then, they were about the same size there. If you look back in the 1760s over here, like this, all of these were pretty much the same size. So, and how would you describe the town? This is a math standard during your classes there, so we might as well do a graph somewhere in here and have them describe that trend. Boston grew fairly steadily, and it reached about 200,000 people in the year before the Civil War. So that by the French and Indian War time, we're sitting down here at about 20,000 people in Boston. Now we've added Charleston. It had about 20,000 people, but it grew a whole lot more slowly than Boston. So that by 1860, it was barely 1/4 as big. If I add the line for Philadelphia, it had about 25,000 people way back at French and Indian War time. How come it grew so much faster? Well, that's a little bit misleading here, that even by 1820, it was larger than Charleston and Boston put together, and therefore was a logical place to put the Continental Congress and things like that. But that real big jump is kind of misleading, because what it did was it extended the city boundaries to the county line and swallowed up a whole bunch of what were the suburbs at the time. Then we put the graph for New York on here. And again, you just ask the students, you can even have them write as a writing activity. What's the comparison of this growth? Why would this be growing so much faster? And part of the reason you're going to find out, they will find out, is that Erie Canal, that they were all kind of growing about the same rate back in the 1790s. And then New York and Philadelphia started doing a little bit better, but it took until the Erie Canal, and then New York absolutely took off. So what were the geographic conditions that made such a big difference? Here we could go out to the clickable map, and if you put on all the products, the typical map that you will see in a textbook, it's just kind of too cluttered to read. So the advantage of the clickable map is that you can look at individual things. So the map wood could be harvested in all 13 colonies, but it wasn't the same kind of wood. It was high value wood for furniture and for ship masts. Southern pine trees were basically tapped for turpentine and for tar that you could use to seal ships. That was a much lower value product. The wheat crop basically grows in places that were a little bit cooler, but not too hilly. In other words, it's not going to grow on the coastal plain down here. It's just too hot. There's too many bugs. There's too many weeds. There's too many malaria and yellow fever mosquitoes and things like that. It's just not likely to grow it there. So that's already a reason why Philadelphia and New York would grow faster. The South was making a lot of money selling a couple crops like tobacco and indigo that required a lot of hand labor, but really didn't have very many spin-offs. Meanwhile, the North was the place where you could mine and process iron, and iron would have a lot of spin-offs. The iron could be used to make tools. Iron could be used to make wagon wheels. Iron could be used to make guns. So the different products that they were making in these different regions helped to explain why New York, Philadelphia, and places like that were growing a little bit faster. Now you can put all the products on there, and you see, just what combination of products are likely to employ the most people and to support the growth of large cities, and therefore to to create the conditions for economic and political clout. So the clickable map has got a map of population. You can compare with that. And now we put the map of the cities on here. Can you see why Philadelphia and New York wound up growing so much faster than the other cities? Could the jobs that people could do in different regions have an influence? And this is one of the things that you want to watch for as your kids are doing the colonies game. Are they really paying attention to the jobs and the spin-off jobs that are created by having a job like an iron mine? How many people does it take to produce a unit of output? And how many additional jobs are created by the production and the sale of that product? These are the economic activities and ideas that are still important for responsible citizenship today. So with that, I'm going to say I've given you the raw materials for a variety of short activities that can be either demonstrations or independent activities that can involve some web reading, that can involve some graph reading, and can involve some textbook writing and some critical reading. In other words, I'm trying to give you a variety of different things that you can use in this little null spot. And at the same time, build a little bit more solid foundation for both the economic and the civic flex that are going to start becoming really important when we get to the Continental Congress time, to the time of the revolution, to where the revolution happened, and so on. And I'm 5 minutes ahead of time, Dave, so you gave me 5 minutes and I give them 5 minutes.
Well, and I'm going to steal a little bit of that 5 minutes back, but not very much of it. We're about to go on break, but the thing that I forgot, because I was like, why did I have 20 minutes down for the Unit 5 overview, and why did I only take 10 of that? And the answer is I forgot to do the colonies update for this time around. But rather than go through the whole colonies piece, I'm just going to let you know that in Unit 5, I'm going to share my screen here. Students will actually have two two scenarios to grapple with. So the very first scenario is going to get introduced in lesson one, and basically, both of these either set the stage for or bring closure to the French and Indian War. So the first scenario that your scholars are going to deal with here comes in lesson one, and it's your colony has grown significantly this year, and you have colonists who are beginning to set out beyond your borders into territory that is claimed by your neighbors and indigenous people. What will you do about this? So, having worked with a couple of fifth grade teachers who have done this before, a lot of the fifth graders will go to, well, we'll tell them we can't do that. Well, it's not it's not today. You can't always get the word out as quickly as you would like, and you can't monitor quite as well as we can. And some people are going to do what some people want to do. So that'll be the first scenario that kids grapple with for the first half of this unit. And then towards the very end of this unit, we get scenario two, which should sound very, very familiar to those of you who have taught US history for a while. Your colony has survived the French and Indian War, but are now facing a new problem. Leadership across the ocean is struggling to pay for the war and have imposed a variety of new taxes and fines on you that have made it difficult for your citizens to pay. What will you do about this? So, both of these are great scenarios. In Unit 5, we couldn't pick which one we wanted to do. So, we're like, you know what? We're going to do both of them because both of these are great things for kids to spend some time, sitting around discussing with their group, trying to come up with a solution, and we'll see whether or not any of their solutions match what actually ended up happening. But it is 5:28, so we are going to take a 5 minute break, and we will come back. Excuse me, at 5:33 and kind of bring this home with the back half of activities. So we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. Breaks are never long enough, but we're going to trooper through here through the last few activities. That is sort of up to me for the next little bit. So um, apologies in advance for a large chunk of Dave here, because Phil tends to be a little bit more fun. But still, we're going to move into, we've pretty much said everything we're going to say about lesson one. Now we're going to sort of move into lesson two, which Phil also sort of got into already with the settlements piece. We're going to talk a little bit about this perspectives piece. So one of the things that we like to bring into Giants whenever we're able to are some practical ways of applying the C3 framework to our lessons and activities. Some of you have signed up for or attended the in-person. I'm also offering it virtually, but I've been doing a series with my teachers called Inquiry Day by Day. And I've been working, Chris can attest, I've been working with my teachers up north for quite some time on inquiry-based instruction. And I feel like most of them are fairly confident, working from a IDM, an inquiry design model piece. But I also recognize that you can't teach like that all day, every day. It's why Giants itself is set up like an IDM, but isn't run like an IDM. So Inquiry Day by Day is the training that I've been running for the last 2 years, that I'll run for 2 more years as we go through each dimension of the C3 framework, and really talk about, okay, so what practices can I do in class that provide me an opportunity to practice little components of inquiry without going all in with the very formal process that's sort of outlined by the C3 framework. So like I said, while we've set up each Giants unit like a big IDM style inquiry, we also recognize that running your class from an IDM takes a lot of energy. And there are times when we need to practice some of those skills that make up inquiry based instruction just in small bursts. So, with the perspectives activity, this is an opportunity to do just that. So, up on my screen right now, you're going to see basically 3 sheets of paper that you're going to print a bunch of copies of, and you're going to cut right down the center. And you're going to break your students up into groups of 3. And you're going to explain that each person in their group will explore one of these 3 perspectives involved in the war. You've got a Frenchman, an Englishman, and an Indigenous person. And all 3 of these people are real people. You'll obviously recognize George Washington's name, but the other 2 were also real people. We did a little bit of research for this and reached out to some friends for some help, in particular with the Indigenous perspective. And basically, if you did in Unit 4 the town hall simulation, even if you did part of it, it's almost like a mini small version of that, because in these groups of 3, one of them is going to be Jacques, one of them is going to be George, and one of them is going to be our Indigenous representative. And they're going to have about 10 minutes to read about who this person is, try to answer some of those questions that are there, and then sort of introduce themselves as their person to their colleagues, to the other people in their group. So you're going to let them know that they are going to imagine that they themselves are this person living in 1753. They should consider how they may think or act or speak. So in terms of like, probably are not going to sound exactly like, probably not going to sound exactly like some of the students in your class, but how do we actually get them to talk sort of like these people when you only have a 10-minute period of time? It's called acting. So while you won't go into big details here, encourage them to spend some time thinking about how each person would respond to these activities. Now, I'm looking at the chat, and Patty has offered up that her students love this particular activity. Patty, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot for a minute, can you tell me like what parts of it really seem to resonate with them?
I think honestly that the kids just like to learn different perspectives and then share what they know, because I don't give every student the same person. I split them up. So not everybody reads about the Indigenous, not everybody reads about George Washington. And at first they're like, oh, we got George Washington. And then when they hear the other students explain who they got, they're like, oh, we got George Washington. Not really, but it's fun and exciting to see them get people that they aren't going to get out of a textbook necessarily. And they really enjoy it.
That's really cool. I appreciate you letting me put you on the spot for this, because, Patty had asked me at the start of this, hey, I would love to sign up for it again. Are you okay with me coming back to Giants again? Because Patty was with us the first time around. And I told her, yep, we've updated some of the lessons and you're more than welcome. And I just love working with Patty in general. And the fact that I also have someone here who's been teaching for a while that I can say, hey, Patty, have you done this activity? How did it go? Is useful as well. So, and there are several of you who I've worked with for a while who I love working with, but I don't know how familiar all of you were with Giants prior to this year. So thank you again, Patty, for letting me put you on the spot. Now, another thing you can do with this activity, and you can either do it with that portion of it, or you can do it as a separate piece afterwards. And this is something that's brand new. It's just getting added to the lessons right now. But Phil had sent me because both this unit in fifth grade and the unit we'll be outlining tomorrow night for eighth grade are very reading heavy, as Phil has already alluded to. Phil sent me some ideas of additional things to put in, and one that I really liked was, I believe it came from the New York Times, and they had their 6-word summaries. And so, after you've had the students kind of introduce themselves as these people to each other in their small groups, I recommend you think about modeling for them and having them try their hand at creating a 6-word summary of their person and what their person believes in based off of what's there. So I'm going to sort of demonstrate, and the process that I'm going to outline here is very similar to the process that Phil and I use with some of our collaborations. So there have been some easier summers where Phil has something that he's already written and he ships it off to me, and I digitize it and make it interactive and make it pretty. And I enjoyed those summers, but I've also really enjoyed, in hindsight, not necessarily in the moment, I've also really enjoyed the summers where Phil drops a collection of spreadsheets and articles and things like that on my lap and says, it's like the mashed potato scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He's like, this means something. And we sort of sit down and poke through what it could be. And I go off and I'll draft some things and come back. And Phil edits me down. How dare he? But he's made me a lot better at being concise when I need to. And so I tried to weave into this modeling piece a little bit of what Phil and I do every summer as well. So this is not a 6-word summary, but this was me in my office this morning trying to come up with, okay, how would I start doing this? Because if you tell your kids summarize this in 6 words, they're not going to be able to do it. So not only do you have to model it, but you have to model how you might go about doing this yourself. So I started with, okay, if I wanted to summarize this part on George Washington in a sentence, and I'm not going to worry about the word count, what might it be? So what I came up with was George Washington fought in the French and Indian War and led a group of soldiers responsible for asking the French to vacate the area. Now, there's 100 things I would do differently. This was me in my office because I didn't want to think on the spot in front of you all this evening. But it's a decent enough start, and it hits some of the major points that were in there. But the problem is we're looking for a 6-word summary, and this one is 24 words. So, what I then did was I channeled my inner Phil, and I said, okay, so Dave, we don't want 24 words. Let's see if we can edit this down a little bit. So here is my second edit. George Washington fought in the war and led soldiers to the French to ask them to leave. Again, not perfect and definitely not 6 words, but I did shorten it by 6 words. So we went from 24 down to 18, I guess. So that's a quarter of the way there, right? But we're teaching kids with this opportunity here. We're teaching them how to edit and how to be concise. And you all may have some ideas of how to word this differently too. Like some of you may not like the fact that I put the war instead of the French and Indian War, but if this whole unit's about the French and Indian War, I can afford those words. I can afford to leave those words behind because we're talking about that's the war that we are talking about in this particular unit. So Let's see if I can shorten this a little bit further. So we went from 24 to 18, which is a good start. Here's the next one. Washington and his troops ask the French to leave. Again, it's not perfect, but this is again summarizing overall what that particular part of that activity was about. And we are not at 6 words yet, though. I did shorten it by 50%. We went from 18 words down to 9, but we still have to lose 3. So, recognizing that 6 words may not be the best for this, but I still have this activity I've boxed myself into. Here is one final edit that brings it down to 6 words exactly. Washington asked the French to leave Virginia. Now I've lost some things here, haven't I? I've lost the fact that, Washington didn't go up by himself. He had his troops. I'm not really talking about the time period, but we have that context under the umbrella of the unit that we're in. And what we could do with this is I don't particularly love this sentence, but this was my first attempt at doing it for this. Now ask your students to workshop it and say, those of you who read Washington, I want you to go out in the hallway for a minute, or I want you all to meet in the back. How would you summarize this short reading on Washington that you developed your introduction speech on? How would you write your 6 word sentence? And then when they've done that, have your kids who had the Frenchman do the same thing with the Frenchman, and then have your kids who had the Indigenous person do the same thing with the Indigenous person. The point is not to get a perfect 6 word summary the first time out of the gate. The purpose of this is to, again, practice that summarization skill, which is super important, and we're always looking for new ways of doing that. Give some modeling for kids on how they can be concise with their written language, and then give them the opportunity to practice this. And then you can circle back to this even as an exit ticket multiple times throughout this and future units, and not even just in social studies. Anytime you're doing a reading with kids in any of your classes, since I have a Zoom room full of folks here who probably teach multiple subjects throughout the day, because most of you are still somewhat self-contained or sharing. So use this 6 word summary in other pieces as well. So I'm going to write up a little blurb on this and stick it into the unit plans here, but I hope that you find it valuable and useful because as frustrating as I found it working with Phil, and I believe there was an email at one point the first summer that we did it this way where I was like, Phil, I want you to just tell me what you want it to say. And Phil's near instantaneous response back, because when we're emailing over the summer, it's almost like AOL Instant Messenger, was, I could do that, but I'm not even certain what I want to say, and you need to learn this skill, buddy. From that, I decided to weave a little bit of that perspective of my own into some of the activities that we have here in Giant. So give 6 word summaries a try. Let us know. Let us know how it goes, and if you have any valuable insights. Or if your students have any valuable insights. And I'd love to know if you do try this, feel free to shoot me an email saying, here are some of the best and worst of the 6 word summaries that I got from my students. And I will applaud all of them, because your worst ones will probably still be better than my final attempt here. So Phil would still edit me a little bit more, I'm sure. But in this particular case, I did go from 24 words to 18 words to 9 words to 6 words, which was the point. Phil, anything you want to add about 6 word summaries or why we might practice this from your perspective?
Well, the New York Times article was about a simpler subject than history, because history really should always have time and place, what we do with the geohistogram, plus the actor. So that automatically gives you one. I would just rephrase this to say, let's make it a 9 word summary, because I was trying to think of what my 9 word summary would be, and it would be Washington led army to evict French from Fort Duquesne. That you want to have your 9 word summary should have the actor, the time, the place, and the event. And that automatically gives you 4 words, so if you've got any kind of glue in there at all, you're going to need more than 6. You just might want to start with, say, 9 or 10 as the target.
All right. Well, I will not give them that option tomorrow night when we do something similar with the eighth grade teachers. But for fifth, I could see a 9 word summary. But you're very right. What I don't like about my final summary here is that, well, first of all, I just recounted and it's 7 words, so I've still failed. But I also don't like how much of the meat of what was in there I ended up losing from it. But again, that was just me in my office with a first attempt. But I could probably have done something with my 9 word summary up here that, if I could have stayed at 9 words, I probably could have rearranged that sentence a little bit more. So, still a very good mini lesson in writing and specificity. So, yeah, please let us know how it goes if you choose to go down this route. All right, so now I want to get into I'm going to close this here. We're still in lesson 2. Want to get into some famous figures. And one of the things I love about history is the study of people that are just plain fascinating. And while I like to celebrate those people's accomplishments in line with the history we're studying, the way we frame giants sometimes makes that hard. Phil normally kicks off a panic attack for me on, right on schedule. About, a week after every rollout, I will get an email from him saying, structurally, we have some major issues with the next unit. And then I hyperventilate into a paper bag in my office, and then I go and I look at the units, and I work up the courage to look at the units, and I start with our compelling question and our supporting questions, and I sort of go in line with some of his thoughts, and I go, you know what? You're absolutely right. I might teach this thing over here, and I might do this one here, but in modeling an inquiry-based curriculum, this is how we made the choice. So sometimes when you do an inquiry-based curriculum, you end up with some lessons that may not necessarily go in the exact order that you might teach them, and that's still okay. You just take your supporting question sign down and put the other one up when you do that activity, and then go back to them. Inquiry is a little bit messy, but I bring this up because I decided a few years back that I was going to do a presidential biography read through. And I started, as one would, with Washington and the Chernow book, which, if you've ever seen, is like this thick and it's printed on Bible paper, and the the print is teeny, 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 tiny. And this book for me was incredible. And I sat down and I devoured this whole book in one weekend. My wife was sick, my children were sick, so everyone was upstairs. And I just read and I didn't stop reading. I read from the early morning into the evening, and it was amazing and it was wonderful. And I learned so many interesting things about Washington that I did not know before. And some of it found its way into some of the Giants units. But you know who else I love? And there's a reason why we picked these two famous figures in particular, is good old Ben Franklin. And I have a book on him that he wasn't a president, so I'm not allowed to read him yet, even though I totally will. And I have a great book on him. I've actually been stalled, for those of you wondering, on James Monroe for 4 years now. I thought John Adams was boring. James Monroe is the boringest boring to ever bore the boring. And I haven't even gotten to Millard Fillmore yet. So I have all these books and I have the best of intentions, but I don't know when I'm going to get to them. But Washington was fascinating. And then Ben Franklin, I have always found fascinating too. He's just an interesting guy. And they both have some pretty big parts to play in what comes up in this unit and next. So we have this famous figures presentation, because I wanted to provide you with a slide deck that was informative, but also allowed you to weave in any existing activities and assignments that you may already have. And if you don't have any for this, consider adding a slide at the end of this deck where you have students create a, Pokemon style trading card on either Washington or Franklin. Um, essentially ask your kids, if we made a Pokemon card for Franklin, what would his stats be and what would his short paragraph description be? And if you're like, Dave, what the hell is a Pokemon? Don't worry, your kids will know. So if you say, we're going to make a Pokemon trading card on George Washington or Ben Franklin, you get to choose which one. Um, Someone in your room will know what that means, and they'll be able to tell you more than you ever wanted to know about Pokemon trading cards about it. So, if you don't have any activities that weave some of these folks in, use this as a baseline to sort of teach your kids a little bit about Washington and a little bit about Franklin. And then, as a kind of quick assignment, give them a 3x5 card, and as for homework, have them develop a trading card on either Franklin or Washington and just see what sort of comes up. But one of the things we have in this presentation, however, is, we've pointed out a few misnomers that tend to be out there. Like the whole cherry tree story is really nice and it's this cool urban legend, but there doesn't appear to be much historical justification that tells you that that whole cherry tree thing actually happened. And the wooden teeth are a little more over exaggerated than we may want to go into as well. So we try to correct some of those misnomers on both of these guys. But Franklin, it's hard sometimes to understand what could be a misnomer and what's true about this guy because he was so odd. I mean, you had him writing as a woman in his brother's paper, having those conversations about that, and you had him over in France for a great deal of the revolution and the Revolutionary War period. And while he was drumming up support for the colonies, he was doing some other questionable activities while he was over there. I mean, the man enjoyed the heck out of himself, while he was there, which is great. And you don't begrudge him that. But, he's just fascinating. I mean, between electricity and his experiments and everything else. Yeah, these are great folks. So we have this famous figures presentation here for you to kind of spend a little bit of time going through with your kids. I am the youngest of four, technically really two, because my sisters are half sisters and they're both so much older than I was. I didn't really live with them for very long. I cannot imagine being the 15th of 17 children. I mean, Franklin was the second to last addition to a very full classroom. If you think about it, like there's a nice elementary classroom is in the early 20s, and I think that Washington being 15th of 17 children, that is crowd control. Those parents, like, I don't know. My wife and I are perfectly matched with two daughters, and I feel like we are moments from being toppled as they move further into their teen years. And so I could not imagine being the parents of 17 children. That's quite a bit. He did not have a lot of formal schooling for someone who accomplished as much as he did. And yeah, the silence do good letters. I love that particular story as well. So if you don't have anything on these two gentlemen already, I highlight these two for a specific reason that you'll see when I get into some of the French and Indian War activities. But we've given you a little bit on both of these men because they're just fascinating. So any questions on this part of the units? Well, as I keep closing tabs, you can see I have these tabs left, and when I've closed all of them, we'll be talking about assessment and signing off for the evening. So for those of you who are counting the number of tabs on my screen, we're into the course of the war part now. So we have this at the very end of lesson 2, but you can move it around to wherever you might like it best. It should come after the famous people presentation, though, because we bring Washington and Franklin back in this in the hopes that the connective tissue gets reinforced with your students. So I'm going to spend a minute to kind of go through this. I'm not going to run the slide deck, but I'm going to, keep it up here. And this map, which is a fairly, maybe I will run it through the slide deck. This map, which is a fairly common, your textbook has some version of this map in it because it's a very common map that sort of shows the territorial boundaries of France and Great Britain and Spain and the European powers that are over here in the United States. And if you look at it, you can notice there are some issues that are definitely going to rise up. You've got the French sort of in this interior corridor there. You've got the British along the coast. You've got the Spanish sort of filling in wherever else. And all of this is going to be destined for some form of conflict as groups start to go, hey, I kind of want to come over here too. So, not to mention, this doesn't even have the indigenous folks listed on this map that have been here all along. So, looking at this map, a question to ask the students is who controls the most territory, who has the most people. We can tell who controls the most territory based off this map because there appears to be more blue on this map than any other color, although orange could give it a run for its money if it were to trail off down here. But we don't necessarily know who has more people just by looking at this map. So the French had the largest territory on this map in particular. They were the first ones that started exploring from Europe around the Great Lakes region. They, moved down into the Ohio area and further down through the Mississippi River. They had sent traders, they'd sent trappers, they'd set up trading posts. They were fairly well established in this area. But the British also claimed some land nearby, including some overlapping territories. And you can see in the purple, these are territories that were ceded by France to Great Britain. And they're not all connected, are they? So, you've got this purple area over here. And to get to it, you've got to go through this blue territory, which is French. So, um, you know, and everyone who was coming over to the new world was like, yeah, you see it, it's yours, go for it, have fun, wonderful, awesome. So obviously there was not a ruling party's group chat going on saying, hey, did you tell your people they could come over into our zone? Because that's not how this works. I like the group chat analogy because we know superintendents always have group chats when they're trying to decide whether or not they are going to close schools because nobody wants to be the first one to go. But if they all agree at once that, yep, nope, we'll close, then they feel a little bit better because they know they're not sticking their necks out there. But the rulers in Europe were not communicating effectively about, what permission they gave who to go where. And of course, at this point in time, nobody from Europe knew where the West Coast was. We're still in this chunk of we're still in this chunk of the country. Obviously, the Spanish may have had some inclination based off of where they ended up, but this does not mean that there were people at every square inch of this particular portion of the map. It just means that they were claiming this particular region. So as more and more settlers continue to come, as the ranks begin to swell, they want to move further inland, and in moving further inland, they run into either other European territories or indigenous peoples. All of these sides sort of had their own little dealings and interactions with the indigenous peoples that were here before any of us got here. Some of them were positive, some of them were negative. The vast majority of them are negative, probably from the indigenous standpoint, because they went from like, yep, we live here to, yep, we don't live here anymore because you've taken our land with your, you've taken our land. So as we move further in, we run into this problem of overlapping groups trying to set up and grab territory in similar spots. The French had their feelings about it, the British had their feelings about it, the indigenous folks had their feelings about it. And basically, as we start to get back into some of these famous figures that I talked about before, you've got George Washington here, who was a young individual. He was a land surveyor at one point, fairly humble beginnings. He didn't come from a rich family, but definitely was in the right place at the right time in many instances throughout his life. And he ended up commanding part of the Virginia militia during this. And one of their first tasks was to go and ask the French politely to leave. And George Washington was an awesome guy. You don't write books this long about somebody without them having accomplished some things that are, kind of interesting and cool. But as amazing as George Washington was, the French were like, yeah, no, we're good. No, we're good. We don't need to leave. So then he had to bring his troops over and try to make them leave by force, and that did not go well. And these are some of the early skirmishes of the French and Indian War. So Washington ended up building a small fort called Fort Necessity. He built it on low ground. I can listen to Phil talk for days about locations of forts and why they were either defensible or indefensible. But this particular case, he built the fort on low ground, and the French came to attack it. They were able to hold it for a little while, even though they were outnumbered. But when it began to rain, soak their gunpowder, they were forced to surrender the fort. Washington escaped and learned an important geographic lesson: low ground isn't always the best. So I was hoping I would get a little chuckle from Phil on that, but I didn't. So I just wove in there an important geographic lesson there for you. The location of the fort, guys, is that a condition or a connection, or is it both? We'll talk later. So meanwhile, in a place called Albany, the French and their indigenous allies were better at fighting in the wilderness than the British in their bright red coats were. You would think after a while of losing, basically wandering through green territories in bright red things that just scream "shoot me," you would think that the British might, have rethought their uniforms a little bit, but nope. They were better at fighting in the wilderness than the British were, and the British stuck out like sore thumbs in said wilderness. So the British decided to get some allies from the indigenous folks themselves. And another famous figure ended up taking charge of the meeting that I'm referencing here, and that would be Ben Franklin. We had the Albany Congress here, and it was an attempt to get the colonies to form one big one and include some of their native allies. They were hoping to pick up the Iroquois, who had recently united 6 different tribes into something we've already discussed, the Iroquois Confederacy, which we like to do in Giants is bring up the controversy behind some of these things in the rollouts. But then, because our standards require us to teach things like Iroquois Confederacy, we also have that terminology in the lessons and the resources as well. So you get to do both things. Basically, the British needed the Iroquois to fight, and some reluctant indigenous folks did join in, but they didn't really want to get involved in a war, especially between 2 parties that they don't necessarily care for themselves. So basically, this presentation on the French and Indian War is going to take you through the major highlights to go along with some of the activities that are available in these units. And by the end of it, we get into some activities on the Treaty of Paris. So this is closing down lesson 2 of Giants. Is where we get into the French and Indian War. And like I said, this presentation is the last thing here, but there are other activities, and you can move this presentation anywhere that you want it. We put it here because it kind of puts the capstone and tells the whole story of the war, and then sort of ends and trails off and is a nice lead into lesson 3. But again, move it where it makes the most sense to you. Spend a couple of days with it, spend 1 day with it. It's completely up to you and the amount of time that you have. So now I'm going to finish by going into lesson 3, which starts our road to revolution, which again, we're going to continue in lesson 1 of unit 6. So if you're like, gosh, where is more on all of this stuff? It's coming in the next unit, and you can always jump ahead if you need to before this. But getting into 3 different documents here, we're going to start with the slides from the Treaty of Paris. When it comes to this activity, this is one that remains unchanged from its original incarnation from when we first did the units, but this is one that, depending on the needs and abilities of your students, you may choose to adapt a little bit. So I do a lot of observations and new teacher mentoring sessions with teachers as part of my role now. And despite some progress over the last couple of years or 2, we are still seeing kids performing well under where they did before the pandemic, and that bubble is going to continue to travel through the grades. Now, the good news for you, for everyone who's in this call, is that you're going to notice that reset well before the middle and high school teachers do, because for you guys, that reset is coming in the next couple of years. You're going to, in a couple of years, have kids who did not experience learning loss from COVID because they were not in school yet when COVID hit. So that time is coming. So hopefully you will be able to go back and start doing some things that you used to be able to do pre-COVID with students again soon, because those gaps are going to be different. So you guys are going to notice this well before my 8th grade teachers, who I'll see tomorrow night, are going to, but it's coming for you a lot faster. So just be aware it's coming. That's not to say that the groups who are 3rd grade and below are, perfect and exactly where they were, where these groups were pre-pandemic. I am saying you're going to have a group very soon that didn't experience a learning loss due to the pandemic because they started after things were back a little bit closer to normal. So if you need to, take these sections and run them through Chat GPT. I talked about Chat GPT last time, and I said that you can, take a selection of text like this, and you can copy it and paste it right in, and you basically ask the AI, can you make this text more accessible for a 5th grader? And ChatGPT will say, of course, please provide the text you'd like me to make more accessible, and I'll do my best to simplify it. And that's where you can then paste it in. And I love that they have programmed in this little paused response, because technically they could instantaneously give you these results. But to make it seem a little more human-esque, they add in these pauses here to make it look like it's actually typing you a response. So I have not looked at this one yet. I just did this one cold. And this is never the draft that you end up giving your kids, but it is a draft that you can use to then build your own final version, because there may be some pieces that it ended up taking out. But actually, looking at this, it did a fairly decent job. So Phil talked a little bit about impression of sailors. And that's what that first part of the Treaty of Paris really gets, that we've selected here, really gets into. It talks about what to do with the soldiers who were impressed and what to do with the ships and the materials. So ChatGPT did a decent job of translating that part of the Treaty of Paris. So feel free to use the AI to make your life a little easier if your kids aren't up to the dissection of that primary text themselves yet. The second part of this gets into fishing rights for France, which, if you look back to the maps that we included in that French and Indian War overview PowerPoint, you may understand why this was an important part of the Treaty of Paris as well. And then you get this final portion in part 7 that talks basically about territorial boundaries and who can go where and who can go no further than what. What I love about this is this whole treaty itself. There's a joke in the high school courses in high school world and high school US. A great question is, what was the cause of World War II? And the answer that any high school history teacher will give you is the end of World War I. Because the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, basically did such a horrible job of righting some of the wrongs that led to World War I to begin with, that it ended up basically ensuring that World War II was going to happen. So we have something similar here in US history with the Treaty of Paris. This treaty itself is unenforceable. It's very hard to enforce. The agencies that would enforce this treaty are all the way across an ocean, and it takes weeks for news to travel from point to point. There's no text messages, there's no buried telecommunication cables. It is simply a 6 to 8 week, in the best of weather, journey by boat from one place to the next, not to mention the travel time inland from either place. So it is very hard to enforce this treaty. Anyone who might breach the treaty or ask permission to breach the treaty are probably also not going to be willing to wait for the response, nor do they actually want a response from the mother country. So the Treaty of Paris itself tried to address the concerns of the day, but it didn't include very much in the way of the voices from the people who would have to live through it. And this is something we hope students come away from this set of activities knowing. So the Treaty of Paris is one of the first reading activities that we have in lesson 3 to get kids to sort of understand that, yep, the war is over and we did these things, but we are headed towards another war, and there are some places that you can have some conversations there. And I saw Phil raise his hand, so Phil, go for it.
I was wondering whether you wanted to look at the board game.
Why don't you go ahead and show off the board game for a sec while I get the last couple of pieces set up? Will that work?
Yeah, because that should have actually gone before the treaty.
Where is that, Phil?
Uh, on my PowerPoint here.
Oh, got it. You share your screen. You're good. I can see it.
Like I say, this was something to set up the discussion about the treaty. And if I could go back to have you picture the map that Dave had showed you about the territory controlled by the French and the territory controlled by the English. There's one thing that is left out of that map that is geographically very important. And that is that the British were filling the land with settlers. They were coming in there, they were making farms, they were cutting down forests, they were building iron mines and so on. The French sprawled over a very large territory, but arguably they never got more than about 1 mile away from a big river or lake. So the actual map of the French control wouldn't be that great big blue blob in the middle of the territory there. It would be a bunch of very thin little veins, almost like a map of your circulatory system, veins and arteries. And the populations were hugely different. And we wanted to get at that a little bit with a way to summarize what was going on, but that would also link it back to your colonies game. So we used the colonies game map, and then Dave and I went back and forth about setting up the board game here. We picked the raw material for this is just a long list of dates when people built missions, forts, trading posts, actually put something on the ground in a particular place. And then there are two versions, and we gave you two PowerPoints. One version is for you to give the list to the students, and they just play a board game like that, kind of like the Risk game or, some of these others like this, where they read the date over there. And we've got three different colors of symbols that you could put on this board game. Yellow for the Spanish, green for the French, and a kind of what Dave refers to as Pepto-Bismol pink um, for the British here. That just happens to be the colors that were there. And then the students would sit down there, and in a couple cases, you could see where the Dutch or some other people built a fort here, and then the British captured it and put their own piece on top of it. And you go on step by step, kind of marking out what the territories were like. Because it says we're supposed to describe the French and Indian War and how it affected the British colony toward, these are the actual glicks that we're dealing with here. The other PowerPoint turned that game into an electronic game. And you might choose to do that. So it basically says, in 1564, the French built something called Fort Caroline. And as far as the Spanish were concerned, that was terrible because they'd already marked out Florida as their territory. So it was like, okay, you can build Fort Caroline, but we're planning to take it. We're going to call it Fort Augustine, or we now refer to that as St. Augustine. That was one of the very first things built in North America by a European people. Now, then in 1607, Jamestown was put here, and the French the next year built something called Quebec. British came and built something called Plymouth over here, and the French said, "Oh, are you going to try for New England? We're going to try for New England." And they did Fort Pontarlier, The Dutch came over and built something called, and you can see how this is going, and you can do the PowerPoint yourself, and you can go down through the list here, and you can see how it's almost like somebody in some boardroom in some military college in Paris or London is sitting down there with a map of North America saying, where should we go build ourselves another fort? And so we get Michilimackinac here, and we get Fort Frontenac and Fort Niagara. The French are busy marking out their territory. The British are building these forts and then separate, they're expanding inland here. The French are just building the forts along the rivers and the big lakes. And like I say, you can run the PowerPoint yourself. But you can see what's happening here, that they're slowly moving in to challenge each other. Like Fort Toulouse was built down there by the French specifically to challenge the Spanish, to say, you can come into Pensacola if you want, but you ain't coming into our territory. And then the British built Fort St. George, and the French built another one over here. Now that's about when it really ticked the British off. They like, you're going to build two forts over there. We're going to put one out here at the end of Potomac River here. Oh, whoops! You just built Fort Duquesne. Now you've got two places where the forts are right next to each other. You could just about predict that's where the battles are going to occur. That's where Washington's going to get involved, trying to persuade the French to leave that place that they were out there. So the French captured Fort Oswego, the French captured Fort William Henry, and the British built the biggest and toughest fort of them all, Fort Stanwix. That, by the way, is a great Wikipedia website. You can go out and read all about how they were constructing that one there. When Stanwix was there, the French decided to abandon that fort. The British then captured Louisburg, and now this just becomes a numbers game. And one by one, the British are capturing these forts. The War of North America is over. Britain has won. It continued, however, for 2 more years in Europe, because to the French, they didn't have that many people over here. They didn't have that much skin in the game, and they had pretty well trapped out most of the furs. So the fur trade had kind of died off a little bit. And the French just decided, we're out of here. So the Treaty of Paris came along, and now we set the context for what was going on and who gets what. Spain gets Louisiana from France. Britain gets Canada from France. Britain gets Florida from Spain. Spain gets, and so on. Like I say, we got 2 different versions of the PowerPoint. And you can play it as a game with the kids and have a bunch of little markers. Coke and Pepsi bottle caps work real well if you don't want to buy markers like this. And that's the 5-minute version of the board game, to see how these different countries were kind of marking out territory by building forts in different places. And it helps to put Washington's trip out to Fort Duquesne into a bigger context here, which is part of what this was all about. Stop share.
Thank you for that, Phil. When we go over, Phil and I try to meet usually the week after a rollout and try to think, okay, let's go over together the next unit and let's develop the agenda and go from there. And I don't know how I missed putting that one on the agenda, because that is another awesome addition to our French and Indian War piece. So I'm glad we were able to find some time to add that piece back into tonight's rollout, because that's a really cool activity that I had forgotten existed in my prep work for my portions of this evening. So thank you, Phil. I'm going to make this last part really quick, because we are not at 6:30, but we're approaching 6:30. And as usual, you guys have been a fantastic studio audience here, captive audience here. But our last couple of things that I wanted to share with you. we get to this activity set from digital history on the problems that England faced. So, and I'll talk about this again in a sec, but I'll do it here. We've got this piece on the problems that England faced after the French and Indian War, and it's a fairly accessible piece for kids. And really, we're looking at the problems piece. So if you have them read nothing else, if you share nothing else with them, these three problems, you could even cut each problem out and give them to different kids and do a similar activity as the perspectives activity from earlier in the unit. But the first problem were what to do with Western lands. They include some possible solutions, but you could have kids, again, when they're thinking about their colony game and their second scenario from Unit 5, these might give them some ideas and clues for directions that they could choose to travel. The second is with trade regulations, is another major problem that Britain faced after this. And again, we've got some possible solutions, but this is the biggie. This is the most important because this is what's going to end Unit 3 or end Unit 5, sorry, and begin Unit 6. Letting you know that they had some financial issues that stemmed out of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And so this last handout that we put here is sort of another stomp through that. But with this final piece, Britain's justification for the things that led us to the Revolutionary War, we do like to study history and treat it as this like cut and dry. These brave colonists fought back against the just completely out of touch British. And I don't want anyone to ever walk away from a US history class thinking that the British weren't necessarily out of touch, because that's the name of the game, right? When you have an empire that's thousands of miles away, surrounded by or separated by an ocean, you're always going to be a little out of touch with your subjects across the sea, right? Because of how long it takes information to travel back and forth. But it's also important in telling as complete a picture of history as we can to note that the British did have some legs to stand on when it came to some of their demands of the colonists, because who did fund the French and Indian War? It wasn't the colonists directly, for the most part. It was the British, and you incur some debts when you have that many people fighting. And it wasn't just fighting over in the US, they were fighting in other parts of the world that stemmed out of these conflicts as well. So they had expended quite a bit of money and resources fighting, and they had to pay for it somehow. So the temptation here is to go all in with all the different acts, and you absolutely can. Like I said, lesson 1 of Unit 6 is your friend. We're going to talk a little bit more about it next time. But if you wanted to just introduce the idea here, this article has some very concise paragraphs on each of the major issues that Britain faced after the war. In particular, why they ended up going the route that we're going to study in the next unit. Why did they pass the Sugar Act? Why did they pass the stamp tax? What was America's response to these things? So um, the purpose of this unit was to squarely tell the story of the French and Indian War. And as we get into the Revolution in the next unit, we'll get into some of those familiar things that you're like, well, Dave, what about the Boston Tea Party? Dave, what about the Boston Massacre? Dave, what about the Stamp Act? What about the tax? What about this tax? What about that tax? We're going to get into that in Unit 6 in Lesson 1, but you're going to set the stage for it here. So that's my like to be continued. Every good television drama has that cliffhanger ending that says, could tune in next season to find out how things work out for our intrepid travelers here. To close tonight, I'm going to say, tune in early March to find out how the French and Indian War led to the Revolutionary War. But you guys are all fantastic teachers, so I know you already know this story. But next time around, we're going to highlight everything is going to be related to the Revolution. So by way of closure, before I officially close this off here for the evening, remember that the running agenda document has a link to the assessment folder in it. It looks like it may have traveled down a little bit, but I will make sure that I get that back up to the top here. So, there it is. I'll just copy and paste that up there now. So when you're ready for the assessment for this or any other units, this link, which is in the agenda, is your friend. And 2 years from now, when we have parted and we're not doing a fifth grade rollout, and you lose this link, you can always reach out to either myself or Phil, and we can get you connected with the correct Google Drive link if need be. And you are more than welcome to share this link with any of your fellow teachers who may be teaching this. We just don't have it up online because we don't want students to find it and have the answers to all of the test questions that we spent so much time trying to develop. So remember, you've got access to the assessment folder. And next time is session 5. And I believe it's early March. So it's going to be about 6 weeks before we see you next. But don't hesitate to reach out anytime you have any questions in between. And on behalf of Phil and myself and the Giants team, past, present, and future, thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. We hope that you found tonight informative, and can't wait to see you back here in just 6 weeks' time. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll move into our hour of Q&A for those of you who need it.